Welcome to a journey through valleys forgotten by time, where echoes of ancient drums once stirred the wind and called the spirits to dance beneath silent hills, and where every step carries the soft memory of those who came before. Tonight, you will walk alongside wanderers, tracing hidden paths through misted meadows and reed-filled hollows, feeling the rhythm of drums, the coolness of water, and the whisper of wind. As the world unfolds around you in calm, poetic reflection, the valley lay folded between dark hills, its floor heavy with grasses that bent beneath the soft weight of night dew. And the moon, pale and unhurried, climbed slowly over the ridges as though reluctant to disturb the silence below. No wind moved the sleeping branches that arched above narrow footpaths, and no birds gave voice from the thickets near the stream. For the hour belonged to a hush so deep it seemed to grow from the soil itself, a breathless stillness that wrapped the land like a worn blanket pulled close against the gathering chill. In that quiet, the wanderers came, their figures small and patient beneath the broad stretch of sky, carrying with them the faint smell of smoke clinging to their garments and the dust of far villages crusted at the edges of their cloaks, their footsteps whispering over the roots and stones with the weight of those who have walked too long without company. They came as though guided by something older than stars, for no signs marked the way through the hills, yet their pace never faltered. And though their eyes lifted off into the ridges where the moonlight traced silver across the grass, their path curved steadily downward, toward the heart of the valley where no fires burned and no houses waited. The air there held a different coolness, carrying the faint sweetness of wild sage crushed beneath their steps. And the earth gave back the muted rhythm of feet moving in unison, a slow procession shaped not by haste or fear, but by the same pulse that drives rivers to carve stone over centuries. At the center of the valley rose a ring of worn pillars, half buried by time, the remains of something neither temple nor dwelling. Stones mottled by moss and moonlight, encircling a patch of earth cleared of grass where the soil held the dark sheen of many fires long extinguished. The wanderers stopped at its edge, setting down the bundles strapped across their shoulders, their faces unreadable in the pale light, though the softness of their movements carried the care of those who know this place holds memory too deep for careless hands to disturb. One knelt to brush away fallen leaves from a flat stone darkened by centuries of weather, and another lifted a drum from its wrappings of reed and hide, the surface stretched tight and smooth as though the hands that shaped it had understood the language of trees and rivers and wind. When the first beat came, it was quiet, no louder than the opening of a door in a house long abandoned, a low sound curling outward into the emptiness, as though testing the air to see if it still remembered how to carry music. The hills answered not with echo, but with a stillness more profound than before, a listening silence that gathered like water, filling a hollow. And the wanderers raised their heads as though they too were listeners rather than makers of this fragile rhythm. Another beat followed, slower, deeper, the tone rounded by the night air, and then another, until the valley began to pulse with a sound that was neither song nor speech, but something older than both, something that seemed to awaken the dust clinging to the pillars and the grass bowing beneath the moonlight. The wanderers stood in a circle around the fireless hearth, their shadows leaning long across the stones, and the one with the drum closed his eyes as his hands moved in patterns carried not by thought but by the memory of generations, the rhythm weaving itself into the hush like thread through cloth. Those who listened felt the air shift as though the sound brushed against the edges of things unseen, stirring the branches above so faintly that leaves whispered without wind, a trembling softer than any breeze, yet carrying the weight of presence drawing near. Some said later it was only the night creatures creeping through the underbrush, or the moon touching the earth with cold fingers of light. But the wanderers who stood there felt something older move along the edges of the circle, a patience older than stone waiting to be named again. The drumbeat rose, not in volume, but in depth, each strike sinking through layers of soil and memory. through the roots of trees and the bones of animals long vanished, carrying downward as though the earth itself had become an instrument waiting centuries for this hand to return. One of the wanderers lifted a hollow flute carved from bone, its surface etched with faint spirals worn by time. And when he breathed across its mouth, the note floated thin and reedy above the drum's heartbeat, weaving a trembling line of sound through the stillness, like smoke threading a beam of light. The music gathered slowly, layer upon layer, not bright or swift, but careful as water finding its way between stones. A sound that filled the valley without ever breaking the quiet, as though the land itself had set limits beyond which no hand would dare to play. Fire was lit only after the rhythm had settled into the earth. A single flame coaxed from dried grasses and resinous twigs until it rose steady within the ring of stones, painting the wanderers' faces with a slow dance of golden shadow. The scent of smoke climbed through the branches overhead, carrying the resin's sweetness toward the cold stars, and the air warmed in a small circle where the wanderers stood close enough to feel the heat on their hands, yet left the outer dark untouched. Through the thin music and the muted crackle of the fire came another sound, faint as the memory of footsteps in long grass. Something not made by wind or night creatures, something that circled the edges of the clearing without ever crossing the boundary of stones. The wanderers did not speak. 4 words belonged to daylight and bargaining and names. And this hour asked for silence, shaped only by drum and flute, and the small flame trembling against the dark. The one who played the drum lowered his head so that the shadow of his hood hid his eyes, and the rhythm slowed until each beat carried the weight of long distances walked beneath empty skies. A heartbeat stretched thin across centuries of waiting. Somewhere beyond the ring of trees, an owl called once, its voice carrying low and mournful across the valley before fading into silence again, and the hills seemed to lean closer as though listening for an answer that never came. The music dwindled to a single note held long upon the flute, a line of sound that thinned until it was no more than a breath of air against bone. And when it ended, the night closed around the clearing like a hand gathering something precious back into its palm. The fire sank low, the drum fell silent, and the wanderers stood without moving, as though waiting for the earth to speak again. But only the cold stars burned above them, and the shadows lay unbroken at the edges of the circle. At last they rapped the drum again, banked the coals until only a faint glow marked the center of the stones, and lay down upon the earth with cloaks pulled tight, their faces turned toward the darkness where the hills watched without eyes. The valley held its silence, carrying the memory of sound within its soil, as though the earth itself had listened and would keep the rhythm hidden until another night when wanderers would come again beneath the slow, patient moon. Morning came without haste. The kind of dawn that unfolds like a long-forgotten letter slowly opened after years of dust and silence. And the hills surrounding the valley seemed reluctant to surrender their shadows as the first light traced their edges in pale gold. Mist drifted low across the grasses, thin and silver in the cool air, softening the shapes of stones and trees until the valley looked less like a place of soil and roots than a dream half-formed in the quiet mind of the earth itself. The wanderers rose slowly, shaking the dew from their cloaks, their movements unhurried and silent, as though the night's music had wrapped them in a stillness that could not be broken by ordinary words or morning thoughts. They gathered the few embers that glowed faintly in the ashes, coaxing them back to life with dry twigs until the fire breathed again, its smoke curling upward into the pale air with the faint, sharp smell of resin and charred wood. The warmth spread gently across their hands, bringing the stiffness of long travel back to life in fingers that flexed and turned, as though remembering they belonged to living bodies beneath the weight of cloaks and dust. When they ate, it was only dried fruit and a handful of coarse breads softened by water from the stream. The simple food carrying the faint sweetness of earth and grain, enough to quiet the emptiness in their bellies before the day stretched ahead. Their eyes turned often toward the edges of the valley where the mist lingered, for the hills seemed to hold their breath as though listening still to the echoes of drums that had long since faded into the soil and silence. No voices rose among the wanderers as they shouldered their bundles again, for the air carried a weight of expectation, a sense that something waited beyond the next fold of earth, where the hills leaned close, like listeners pressing their ears against the ground. They moved along a narrow path that wound upward through clusters of low trees, the branches dripping with last night's moisture, so that the wanderers passed beneath a soft rain shaken loose by their own footsteps. The air smelled of moss and the faint sweetness of crushed leaves. And somewhere water moved beneath, the stones with the quiet persistence of things that have flowed for centuries without witness or interruption. Birdsong began only after the sun cleared the ridges. First, a single voice rising thin and hesitant from deep within the thickets. Then others answering until the hills carried a scatter of sound like beads falling across a tiled floor. The wanderers paused where the path curved high above the valley, looking back over the grasslands where the pillars stood like broken teeth in the wide mouth of the earth, the place of drums now small beneath the spreading light. It was there, at the edge of a hollow filled with mist, that they first heard the whispers sliding through the air like threads of smoke, a sound too faint to belong to wind, yet carrying the breathy texture of voices just beyond the reach of words. They stood still, heads tilted, as though listening might weave meaning from the hushed sounds rising from below. But the whispers moved in no language known to them, only the cadence of something speaking slowly through the leaves and stones. One wanderer knelt to press a hand against the soil where the path widened, feeling the faint tremor of water running deep beneath the surface, as though the earth itself carried veins of moving sound too shy to break open into speech. The hollow spread below them in a wide bowl of grass and thorn scrub, the mist lying so thick that the ground seemed to breathe with each slow curl of whiteness, rising, then sinking again among the roots and scattered stones. They descended carefully, the damp air chilling their faces, while the sun above turned a mist into ribbons of gold that drifted around their shoulders like loose cloth tugged by invisible fingers. The whispers thickened as they reached the hollow's center, weaving around them in tones neither warm nor cold, voices without breath or tongue, as though memory itself had chosen to speak through the turning air. No words formed within the sound, yet the cadence held the weight of meaning, a slow rise and fall like the breathing of someone dreaming beneath the soil, carrying neither welcome nor warning, only the presence of age watching from beneath the earth. The wanderers moved among the thorn bushes and bent trees, whose roots clutched at stones like old hands holding tight to forgotten possessions, their steps careful, for the ground here felt soft in places, as though something once buried had long since sunk away. One carried a small rattle of dried seeds bound inside a gourd, and when he shook it gently, the whispers paused, the air holding still for a long moment before the sound returned like wind creeping through cracks in ruined walls. Another knelt beside a pool fed by an unseen spring, its surface dark beneath the shade of leaning branches, the water trembling faintly as though the voices touched it from below rather than above. They did not drink, for the pool carried a bitter smell of iron and stone. Yet they watched as the whispers grew louder where the water lapped against its own muddy edges, a murmuring so soft it felt like breath against the skin rather than sound against the ear. The wanderers placed small offerings at the base of the leaning trees, bits of bread, a carved bead, a feather taken from the ground where some bird had passed before them, gestures of quiet respect given without expectation of reply. The air shifted when the gifts lay among the roots, the mist drawing back slightly as though the hollow exhaled, and the whispers fell softer until they moved like the echo of water slipping through reeds far away. No path left the hollow on the opposite side, only a tangle of rocks and low branches slick with damp moss. Yet the wanderers climbed slowly upward, pulling themselves over roots polished smooth by seasons of rain and wind. Above them the sun leaned higher, breaking the last clinging threads of mist so that light spilled across the stones in thin sheets, warming the chill from the air, though the whispers followed faintly until distance thinned them into silence. At the ridge they rested, looking back once more at the hollow now open to daylight, its floor bright with wet grass and stillness, the gifts lying small among the roots where no wind stirred to scatter them. Some among the wanderers believed the voices belonged to water moving through caverns deep beneath the soil, shaping words only the earth could hear, while others felt the breath of spirits lingering where the drums had once called them to gather. No certainty passed between them, for the valley spoke in ways that carried neither answer nor question, only the slow language of stone and leaf and water sliding through dark channels beyond sight. They traveled on, the path folding downward again, through long grass humming with insects, the warmth of midday settling across their shoulders, though the memory of whispers clung like cool mist along the edges of thought. When they stopped beside a stream to drink, the water ran clear and cold across pebbles smoothed by countless seasons, and its sound carried no voices, only the bright tumbling of current through narrow bends and sunlit shallows. Here they rested beneath an oak whose roots gripped the bank like a great hand rising from the soil, the shade holding the scent of leaf mold and damp bark, a coolness wrapping them while the hours drifted quietly onward. By evening, they reached a stretch of open land where wind moved freely again, carrying the smell of wildflowers and the faint dry scent of distant fires burned by people, unseen beyond the curve of the hills. They camped where the grass grew tall enough to sway like water around them, the sky deepening to violet above the first bright stars, their bodies weary yet untroubled as the earth cooled beneath their blankets. No drums spoke that night, only the wind moving softly through the grass. But some among them dreamed of voices sliding through mist, a calling not with words but with the long patience of places that remember more than they ever tell. And when the fire sank low, scattering its last sparks upward into the vast dark, the valley behind them lay quiet once more, keeping its whispers folded beneath soil and stone where no footsteps lingered to listen. The path led them toward the ridges where the land rose slowly, like the back of some long sleeping creature, its slopes softened by grass and time, the air carrying the faint smell of sun-warmed earth. As morning stretched into the steady warmth of day, the wanderers moved with the unhurried patience of those who knew distance held no meaning beyond the slow rhythm of footsteps, their shadows bending beside them in the high light as though keeping quiet company through the hours. The sky widened overhead, a vast pale blue that seemed to press gently upon the hills without weight, while a single hawk circled far above, its cry thin and distant as it drifted through currents of rising air unseen from below. They came upon the first stones near midday, broken pillars half buried in grass, their surfaces furrowed by centuries of rain and wind until they leaned at angles that suggested neither design nor accident, only the long surrender of shape to time. Moss clung to the lower edges, dark and damp where the shadows pooled, while lichen painted pale circles across the higher faces, patterns spreading so slowly that no eye living could claim to see them change from season to season. The wanderers paused among them, laying hands upon the cool surfaces as though greeting something both stranger and kin, the stones holding the warmth of sunlight only along their upper ridges, while their bases kept the chill of deep soil. No carvings remained to tell what purpose these pillars once carried. Yet the air among them held the quiet density of places where voices had gathered often, as though words and prayers and songs had sunk like rain into the ground beneath. A low wall of fallen blocks traced the edge of a clearing where grass grew shorter, its color faded to the pale tone of straw, as though roots still remembered the press of countless feet long vanished beyond counting or record. The wanderers walked slowly there, their steps stirring faint dust from the dry earth, and the wind moving through the gaps in the stones gave off a sound like breath drawn through hollow reeds, soft and uneven, yet carrying across the open space. Some among them knelt to study the fragments scattered near the wall. small shards of pottery marked by lines worn nearly smooth, while others followed the curve of broken foundations half hidden beneath nettles and thorn. A single tree rose near the center, its trunk split by lightning long ago. The hollow scar, dark against the bright sky, where crows had built a ragged nest, now empty above the hush of the place. The branches spread wide and still, leaves holding the shimmer of heat where sunlight pressed through the thin air, casting a broken lattice of shadow across the dry ground where no grass rose near the roots. The wanderers rested beneath its shade, leaning against the stones, still warm from morning, their hands gathering dust that clung to skin in the faint sweat rising from the days-long climb through gullies and thickets. One drew water from a leather flask, the stream caught earlier holding the taste of copper and stone upon their tongues as they passed it between them, drinking slowly while the air trembled with the faint drone of insects. Beyond the clearing, the land fell away toward another valley, its slopes dark with pines whose scent carried upward on rising heat, the sharp resinous edge cutting through the drier smell of dust and grass. The wanderers listened without speech, for the stones seemed to hold silence carefully, the way certain rooms in abandoned houses gather echoes so faint they can be felt only in the weight of air upon the skin. When the wind shifted, the pillars creaked faintly where roots had begun to push against their buried edges. A groan so deep and slow it might have been mistaken for the earth settling after some long-forgotten dream of movement. The one who carried the drum laid it across his knees, but did not play, only traced the rim with fingers calloused by travel, as though uncertain whether this place wanted song or silence to wake whatever lingered here. Another knelt to arrange small stones into a circle near the tree's roots. Not a fire pit, but a mark of presence, the pattern forming slowly beneath his hands, until it lay like a faded echo of the walls surrounding them. They left offerings against crumbs of bread, a twist of dried herbs releasing faint sweetness when crushed, a thin strip of cloth, the color of river clay, tied loosely to a low branch swaying above the cracked soil. Shadows lengthened while they lingered, the sun sliding westward until the broken walls threw long bars of darkness across the clearing, cutting the ground into pale gold and cooling gray where insects rose in slow spirals of wings. The wanderers moved softly among the ruins, running hands along the toppled blocks where rain had carved thin channels like veins, watermarks climbing and falling through seasons until stone carried the memory of storms no living voice could name. Somewhere among the rubble, they found steps descending into a hollow choked with roots, the air below cooler, carrying the faint smell of damp earth where moisture lingered beyond the reach of sunlight and wind. They climbed down carefully, the narrow way twisting until it ended in a chamber whose walls curved inward like the inside of a shell, the stone there smoother, as though shaped by hands rather than rain or root. No markings showed upon those walls, only the pale glitter of mineral threads where water had run thin as breath along the surface, leaving traces bright as frost when their small lamps cast glow across the dampness. The floor held no dust, though no wind reached this place, only the faint sheen of moisture where their steps left brief prints before fading again, as though the stone wished to keep no record of intrusion or passage. They stood long in that hollow, breathing the cool air where every sound seemed to fold back upon itself, a quiet so deep it carried its own weight, pressing gently against the ears like water against skin. One among them hummed a single note, low and steady, and the chamber answered faintly, not with echo, but with a trembling along the walls, as though the stone itself held a thin, secret voice, reluctant to wake fully. The others joined softly, voices weaving until the hollow filled with a chord so gentle it barely stirred the stillness. A sound rising, not toward song, but toward the memory of song, like the shadow of birds crossing far above clouds. When they ceased, the quiet returned, thicker than before, as though listening had drawn the place inward upon itself again, folding shut whatever door had opened for the brief span of their wordless music. They climbed back toward daylight slowly, each step carrying the coolness of the chamber upon their skin. The air warming again as the wind returned with the scent of pine and dust pressing close beneath the fading sun. Evening slid across the clearing where the tree's shadow had grown long enough to touch the far wall. And the stones held the day's heat, now fading upward, like breath, leaving a body surrendering to night. The wanderers built no fire among the ruins, choosing only to eat and rest in the dimness. Their blankets spread across ground, still warm beneath them, while the sky above deepened toward indigo. Stars emerged one by one, where branches did not reach, their faint shimmer drifting in silence across the black bowl of night, until the walls lay silver-edged beneath their gaze. The drum spoke only once before sleep, a single slow beat carrying through the pillars. Its sound neither question nor call, only a soft acknowledgment of presence given to the stones before darkness claimed the clearing entirely. When the wanderers slept, the wind moved again, sliding through broken doorways and gaps in the wall, carrying dust and night air across the open ground where roots clutched ruins older than memory itself. And somewhere beneath soil and fallen block, the hollow chamber held its silence as though cradling the last faint tremor of voices, fading back into the deep patience of stone. The wanderers moved down a gentle slope where the light of afternoon filtered softly through silver-barked trees, each leaf trembling like a thin veil stirred by wind that carried the faint scent of damp moss and sun-warmed earth. Beneath the trees, a stream curved through the valley like a pale ribbon, its water clear enough to reveal stones smooth as glass and leaves drifting slowly along its surface, catching glimmers of light that danced across the ripples with quiet grace. They paused at the edge, kneeling to touch the water, its chill surprising at first before it settled into their skin like a soft hand pressing them into the memory of the valley, the current carrying faint traces of root and soil beneath. The air smelled faintly of rain yet to come, mingled with the subtle sweetness of wildflowers pressed among grasses along the bank. And the wanderers breathed slowly, letting the scents thread through their senses like a quiet song played just for them. Along the stream, stones were arranged in patterns, some tall and leaning, others flat and scattered, their placement deliberate, as though hands long gone had danced here in rhythm with the water, leaving traces for those who might follow in silence centuries later. Occasionally, a fish broke the water's surface, sending small waves curling over pebbles, the sound soft yet distinct against the gentle murmur of the stream, a reminder that life persisted quietly, unseen yet persistent beneath the slow passage of time. The wanderers' footsteps fell lightly on damp soil, each step sinking slightly as if the earth itself acknowledged their passage, and the reeds along the banks whispered low, their hollow bodies trembling with the motion of the wind passing through them. They found fallen logs, worn smooth by rain and the slow weight of seasons, resting across the stream like bridges made by time itself. And the wanderers crossed carefully, the wood cold and textured beneath their hands, its surface faintly sticky with sap and softened by moss. Above them, silver-barked trees bent slightly toward the water, branches dripping with moisture collected from the morning fog, the droplets trembling in sunlight that caught fleeting rainbows in the mist, before falling into the stream or onto the wanderers' cloaks. The sound of a distant bird, high and soft, carried through the valley, echoing off stones and reeds, and the wanderers paused again to listen, their hearts slowing in rhythm with the quiet pulse of life unfolding unseen beneath leaves and water. Here and there, reeds had been cut and arranged in small bundles along the bank, perhaps to mark a path or honor some ancient way, their edges hollow and smooth, ready to catch wind and produce notes that only the trees and streams could understand. The wanderers knelt beside one bundle, touching it lightly, feeling its hollow rigidity and the faint powder of old reeds under their fingertips, as though the valley itself had preserved these fragments of music for those patient enough to notice. The stream curved further into shadow, the water darkening under the canopy of branches heavy with moisture. And the wanderers moved silently, each step measured so as not to disturb the subtle patterns left by wind and animal, by rain and stone, over countless seasons. Moss clung to stones and roots alike, soft and cool beneath the wanderers' hands, leaving a faint trace of earth as they brushed past. The smell of wet green holding memory as tightly as the stones held their shape through years of sun, rain, and wind. A gentle breeze moved through the valley, stirring water and leaves alike, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of stone warmed by sunlight, of riverbed minerals, of fallen wood slowly decaying, all combining into the quiet perfume of a place left largely untouched by human haste. They stopped where the stream widened slightly, forming a shallow pool whose surface mirrored branches and clouds, and the wanderers watched as the water trembled with each passing breeze, the reflections shifting like memories caught between worlds, familiar yet just out of reach. Small creatures moved unseen beneath the water, sending ripples across its surface, the patterns delicate and fleeting, and the wanderers leaned closer, their breath caught in their chests as they traced the invisible paths the water carried, feeling connected to the pulse of hidden life. Sunlight softened further as the day aged, spilling warm gold through leaves into the mist above the water, touching reeds and roots in shifting patterns. And the wanderers allowed themselves to follow these slow changes, stepping lightly so as not to disturb the fragile balance of light, shadow, and sound. The stream's murmurs seemed to grow faintly musical, tones rising as wind moved through reeds, echoing softly across the water, carrying the sense of a rhythm older than the wanderers themselves, the kind that threaded through memory, stone, and leaf alike without need for words. They paused once more beneath an arching silver tree, its branches low enough to brush their shoulders, feeling the coolness of bark against skin and inhaling the sharp, fresh scent of sap, of water, of stone, a concentrated essence of the valley itself in a single place. At the far edge of the pool, stones had been arranged into a small spiral, partially covered by moss and scattered leaves, and the wanderers knelt to trace its shape lightly, feeling the weight of hands long gone who must have worked here with intent and care. The air seemed to hum around them, low and gentle, carrying with it the resonance of water on stone, of reeds bending and rattling softly, of birds and wind threading together into a quiet chorus that lingered, beneath the pulse of sunlight fading into the approaching evening. When they finally rose to continue along the path, the stream followed them in voice alone, its waters moving steadily beneath reeds, over stones, past moss and root, as though it had a memory and a will, carrying stories of seasons that would never be spoken aloud. The wanderers left the pool behind, stepping lightly over roots and moss, the silver trees bending slightly as though seeing them off, the water murmuring softly beneath their feet, and the valley held onto its calm as the path wound slowly onward toward hidden groves and rising hills. In the last light of day, shadows stretched long across the stream, the water catching slivers of sky before darkening beneath overhanging branches, and the wanderers paused once more, feeling the quiet rhythm of the valley, knowing that each step forward was part of a story older than memory itself. The day's heat lingered long upon the hills before finally loosening its hold, and as evening came, the sky spread open with a slow grace, its colors melting from gold into violet, then deepening toward a darkness brushed faintly by the first cold stars. The wanderers moved along a narrow ridge, where the wind carried the thin smell of dust, mixed with the sweetness of drying grasses, its touch warm at first, but cooling with each moment as the sun sank farther behind the distant teeth of mountains. They had walked since dawn with few pauses, their shadows stretching and folding as the day bent around the hills. Yet their steps carried no haste, for the road held no measure beyond the slow rhythm of breath and heartbeat and the steady turning of earth beneath the sky. When they reached the small plateau above a scatter of stones half swallowed by roots and scrub, the light had grown softer, carrying the amber glow of fire waiting in the west. And the wanderers knew the night would find them here rather than farther along the path. They set down their packs in the last warmth of fading sun. The ground firm, yet smelling of old ash where fire pits from seasons past had left their circles blackened among the pale dust of broken grass. One among them gathered dry wood from the slope where twisted trees leaned low, branches rattling faintly as though complaining beneath a cut of knife and hand, their fallen limbs stripped clean by winds that had passed long before the wanderers came. Another cleared the ashes left by travelers unseen, hands moving slowly through the dust, feeling the brittle crumble of charred roots that gave off the faint scent of smoke even after so many rains had fallen since they last burned. When the fire rose, it did so cautiously, a small flame licking at dry bark before catching along the twigs in a thin crackle. Its light laying copper threads across the wanderers' faces, as they sat close enough to feel warmth returning through the cool breath of dusk. They ate little, only the dried meat carried in pouches, bound with sinew, and the grain cakes softened in water until the taste of earth and salt filled their mouths with a plainness that belonged to journeys rather than to feasts or gatherings. Far above, the stars thickened until the sky became a dark river scattered with silver, each point of light steady as though no wind nor season could ever trouble their patient burning across the endless turning of night. The wanderers leaned back upon their blankets, watching them appear one after another, the fire behind them breathing smoke into the air until it hung in faint blue, ribbons between the flames and the constellations overhead. Some among them remembered names once given to those star shapes by people long turned to dust. Yet no one spoke them aloud, for the night carried its own language shaped by the crackle of wood and the faint whistle of wind along the ridge. When the drum was unwrapped, its surface glimmered faintly in the firelight, the hide pale against the dark circle of its frame, and the one who held it waited long before striking the first beat, as though asking permission from air and stone before sound could rise. The rhythm came low and slow, carrying the weight of distance walked beneath sun and shadow, each beat spreading outward into the dark like a ripple across water touched by a single falling leaf. The others listened without movement, their eyes upon the fire, yet their bodies leaning toward the sound as though the drums shaped the night around them, drawing hill and wind and star into the same slow pulse. When the second drumbeat joined, it was softer, struck by smaller hands, a counterpoint weaving through the first until the silence between them thinned, filled by a conversation older than the voices of those who sat around the fire tonight. Smoke gathered overhead where wind carried it eastward along the ridge, the air thick with the scent of resin and dust and faint sweetness from the grass smoldering at the pit's edge where stray sparks had touched its dry edges. One among the wanderers lifted a stringed instrument carved from wood darkened by years of handling, its shape slender as though the maker had carved wind itself into solid form. And when the first note rose, it shivered through the firelight like breath through glass. The song built slowly, layer upon layer, no haste shaping its rise. Only the patience of hands and wind and earth joining across distances longer than memory could hold, until the ridge carried rhythm and tone outward beneath the wide bowl of stars. Those who listened beyond the circle of light, all upon branch, fox beneath thorn, wind through hollow grass, heard without fear. For the music held no sharpness, no edge to cut the night, only the weightless rise and fall of sound, shaped like prayer, settled upon the wind as the fire consumed its own wood. Flakes drifting upward, silver against the dark before vanishing into nothing, their brief flight carrying the faint smell of burned resin across the wanderers' blankets and cloaks. When one voice began to sing, it came almost unnoticed, low and rough from the long day's dust, yet carrying a tone shaped by rivers and smoke and the closeness of mountains where echoes folded words into themselves until language thinned into sound alone. Another voice joined, softer, weaving through the first like threads crossing in slow water, the song shaping no story, yet carrying the weight of countless stories hidden in the rise and fall of its simple melody. The drum beats slowed until they felt like heartbeats half asleep, the strings settling into a hush broken only by wind sliding through dry branches at the ridge's edge where shadows shifted among stones and roots. The fire sank lower, its heart glowing red where the wood cracked inward upon itself. Heat rising in waves, so faint the wanderers felt it only when the wind paused long enough to let warmth reach their outstretched hands. Some lay back upon the ground with cloaks pulled close, watching stars burn above them where constellations gathered like herds along the dark slopes of heaven, their shapes moving only in the turning of hours too slow for eyes to see. The one who had sung first fell silent, his voice leaving the air empty as though a door had closed, the last echoes folding themselves into the earth until only the wind remained to carry anything moving across the ridge. Ash drifted where the fire had been, pale feathers of it settling upon stone and skin alike, each flake vanishing into black soil until the night seemed to swallow its own traces as quickly as they were made. When at last the final drumbeat came, it was softer than any before, a single sound falling like a small stone into deep water, its echo swallowed immediately by distance and darkness and the slow breathing of wind through grass. The fire gave no flame then, only coals faintly red as the wanderers wrapped themselves in silence and wool, their bodies curved against the cool ground, while the stars turned slowly in the black river overhead. Somewhere far off, a wolf gave voice, the sound carrying thin and solitary across hills too distant to see. And then the night returned fully to its stillness, as though no fire, nor drum, nor song had ever troubled its ancient quiet. The ridge lay beneath ash and stars alike, each flake falling, each light burning, while the wanderers slept among the cooling stones where the wind moved softly through the hours, without stirring the smallest spark from the circle of dying embers. And when dawn at last would come, the ash would lie gray and weightless across the fire pit, a memory of flame left for wind and rain to scatter, until no trace remained of the night's song but the silence afterward. The dawn unfolded slowly across the hills, its first light slipping pale and cool through the thin veil of mist rising from the valley floor, touching the wanderers where they lay wrapped in blankets beside the circle of gray ash left from the night's fire. They woke, not with haste, but as the earth itself seemed to wake, the air still carrying the faint chill of hours before sun, each breath leaving a ghost of vapor that drifted briefly above them before vanishing into the widening light. No one spoke at first, for the silence felt old as stone, shaped by the drumbeats that had faded into it hours earlier, and the wanderers seemed unwilling to break whatever still lingered between earth and sky from the night just past. One by one they rose, shoulders heavy with cloaks dampened by dew. Their faces turned toward the east, where the horizon brightened with the color of raw copper cooling slowly into pale gold above the distant ridges still holding shadows. The smell of earth darkened by night clung to them as they moved, a scent of dust mixed with grass wet from the mist, sharp yet clean like water from deep wells, carrying no memory of fire though ashes lay at their feet. They ate little as the sun gathered strength, the plain food taken in silence while the wind brushed the hillside with a restless hand, moving the last curls of smoke from the fire pit, as though erasing the night's song from the earth. The drum remained wrapped, its surface hidden beneath soft cloth tied carefully, as though it were a living thing sleeping within, and no one touched it while the sky grew brighter, for it carried the weight of night still heavy upon it. When they began walking again, the valley opened beneath them, a long green floor stitched with rivers that glimmered silver beneath the newborn light, the air holding both the sharpness of stone and the sweetness of flowering shrubs along the streams below. The path wound downward where boulders leaned against one another like beasts sleeping, their surfaces cool beneath wandering hands. The stone rough, yet carrying a warmth just beginning to gather from the sun breaking higher above the hills. Birdsong drifted from hidden branches as though poured into the air from places unseen. thin notes trembling against the cliffs where echoes returned faint and altered. Each sound a thread weaving through wind and water and the slow steps of the wanderers. Somewhere far ahead, smoke lifted in a thin column, barely visible against the sky. And though no voices reached them, the wanderers knew another circle of fire waited beyond the bend where the valley narrowed into shadow. Beneath leaning cliffs, they walked until the air grew stiller, the wind falling away as though unwilling to enter the narrowing pass, its walls steep and pitted, their surfaces marked by water long since gone, leaving behind the hollow smell of stone, untouched by sun. Here the shadows deepened, though it was near midday, the sky reduced to a narrow strip of white fire above, and the coolness wrapped the wanderers like a river would. Soft, yet carrying the weight of something older than the wind itself. The path widened suddenly upon a hollow where trees clung stubbornly to thin soil. Their roots twisted among rocks, branches carrying leaves pale as though the sun rarely touched them except through this narrow gate in the cliffs above. At the hollow's center burned a small fire beside which 3 figures waited. Their shapes wrapped in long garments of woven bark, fiber-colored with earth dyes until they seemed grown from the valley floor rather than seated upon it. The wanderers approached slowly, each step softened by dust that carried the faint smell of resin from wood burning at the fire's edge, its smoke rising straight into the air without the wind to bend or scatter it against the cliffs. The 3 figures lifted their heads as the wanderers came close, faces painted in sweeping lines of white clay and dark ash, the patterns curling from brow to cheek like rivers bending across plains. Only they seemed to remember clearly. No words came first, for the valley held a stillness shaped by both silence and waiting. The air thick with the warmth of stone and the faint bitterness of roots burning among the firewood where small flames leaned inward against the breeze. One among the painted figures struck a drum taller than the one carried by the wanderers, its frame carved with spirals running from rim to center. The hide stretched tight enough that the first beat rolled through the hollow like distant thunder. The sound did not echo sharply, but seemed to sink into the cliffs themselves. A low vibration that touched dust upon stone until it shivered faintly yet left the air unbroken, as though the valley swallowed each tone with slow hunger. Another figure began to chant words shaped by a language the wanderers did not know, the voice rising and falling in long arcs that blended with drum beats until syllables and rhythm moved, together like water sliding across deep rocks unseen below. The third figure cast something into the fire, handful of leaves, dry and sharp-scented dand. At once the smoke thickened, turning sweet, carrying a fragrance that wrapped itself around skin and hair and cloth until even breath seemed heavy with it. The wanderers sat upon stones offered by unseen hands, the heat of them rising through layers of cloth, as though the earth beneath still carried sunlight trapped within, despite the hollow's cool shadows stretching along the cliffsides. As the chanting deepened, the valley felt changed, though no wind moved. No birds called from the branches above, only the fire's thin hiss and the drum's slow pulse shaping the air into something waiting, something listening beyond itself. The painted figures swayed without speaking, their movements following no pattern, yet circling the fire with steps soft enough to leave almost no sound, their shadows bending long against the stone walls as the smoke thickened around them. When the tallest figure raised both arms, the drumbeats ceased at once. The silence afterward deeper than before, as though every echo had been gathered back into the cliffs where no sound now lived at all. In that stillness, a voice came not from the figures nor the wanderers, but from somewhere within the hollow itself, low and threaded with tones like wind through deep roots, carrying no words, yet filling the air with presence undeniable as earth beneath their feet. The wanderers did not move, though the hair along their arms lifted in the coolness, for the sound held neither threat nor welcome, only the weight of something listening across distances longer than rivers, older than the cliffs themselves. The tallest figure lowered his arms slowly, And as he did, the voice faded like water sinking into sand until only the faint crackle of fire and the smell of sweet smoke remained beneath the strip of pale sky overhead. No one spoke afterward, for the silence felt shaped by more than absence, carrying instead the sense of something vast retreating beyond the edges of hearing, leaving behind only the weightless drifting of ash above the dying flames. The wanderers rose when the painted figures motioned, the gestures slow, palms outward as though pushing them gently toward the path that continued beyond the hollow into sunlight waiting somewhere past the narrow cliffs ahead. When they left the fire's warmth for the cooler shadows beyond, no drumbeats followed. Only the wind returning at last to the valley, carrying the faint smell of resin and ash upon its restless hands through branches high above the cliffs. And though the wanderers did not speak as they walked, each carried the silence differently, as though the voice within the hollow had shaped them in ways neither sound nor language would ever be able to hold again. The valley beyond the cliffs widened slowly, its floor spreading in a long sweep of green meadows where tall grasses bent beneath the wandering wind, their tips whispering together in soft voices that rose and fell like water moving unseen among stones. The wanderers stepped from shadow into sunlight, their eyes narrowing as the brightness broke across the path ahead, turning each dew-heavy blade of grass into a thin needle of silver, trembling beneath the warm breath of afternoon drifting low through the valley. Birds glided above in lazy arcs, their wings catching the light until they seemed cut from pale metal, the air carrying the sharp cry of one, circling far overhead before vanishing into the distance where the hills rose blue and silent again. The path wound downward toward a grove of ancient trees whose trunks swelled wide at the base before lifting in long, smooth columns into branches, spreading a dark roof against the sun, their leaves trembling in slow waves whenever the wind passed through. Among those roots waited a hollow tree older than memory, its bark split wide enough to form a dark arch where the trunk curved inward, the opening large enough that two wanderers might stand within its shadow without brushing the rough walls. The air near the grove carried the sweetness of wild fruit fallen into grass, the smell ripened by days beneath the sun until bees drifted lazily among the wind-stirred branches, their low humming lost beneath the leaves' soft murmur overhead. When the wanderers reached the first circle of shade, the air cooled at once, wrapping them in green light that shifted as branches moved, the ground beneath soft with layers of leaves, long fallen and drying slowly into the soil's dark breath. Beneath the hollow tree stood figures waiting in garments stitched from bark fiber and river grass, their faces unpainted yet carrying the stillness of those who listened more than they spoke, their hands folded loosely as the wanderers approached across the rustling floor. No words passed as greetings, only slow nods beneath the shifting leaves, the kind that carried neither warmth nor distance, merely the quiet acceptance of those who lived close enough to wind and water to measure time differently than others might. A circle of woven mats waited near the hollow where roots bent upward like sleeping animals, their surfaces polished by countless seasons of sun and rain, each mat holding bowls carved from gourd shells filled with food that breathed the valley's fragrances upward. Steam rose from grains boiled soft in clay pots whose blackened rims carried the memory of many fires, the smell of herbs rising with it, sharp yet sweet where leaves had steeped in water before being scattered across the waiting feast. Another bowl held river fish roasted slowly upon sticks until their skins cracked and curled, the pale flesh beneath steaming whenever the wind turned, carrying the scent toward the wanderers as they lowered themselves upon the mats beside the waiting hosts. There were roots sliced thin and baked upon flat stones until edges crisped, and berries dark as dusk heaped in leaf-lined baskets, their skins split where the sun had warmed them, spilling thin trails of juice that glistened against the green leaves below. No voice led prayers, yet before eating the gathered figures lifted handfuls of berries toward the hollow tree, placing them upon a slab of stone beneath its arch, as the wind passed, once through the grove carrying the offering's sweetness outward. The wanderers watched the fruit darken where it touched the stone's sun-warmed surface, the juice running slowly toward cracks filled with centuries of dust. As though the earth itself drank what was given before the hands returned to lift their bowls. They ate slowly, the food carrying the sharpness of roots, the faint smoke of fish roasted among embers, the cool sweetness of berries breaking beneath teeth, each taste holding the valley's soil and water and wind as though none could be separated. Children drifted among the mats with clay jars whose sides sweated with cold water lifted from springs, the smell of wet stone clinging to each pore, the surface trembling whenever leaves shed sunlight in broken patterns across the woven mats below. The wanderers drank with both hands around the jars, the water carrying a chill that ran inward through them like wind threading caves in winter, leaving behind the faint sweetness of minerals gathered along the stream beds, feeding the valley's deeper roots. Above them, the wind moved in slow rivers through the branches, carrying scents of sap and sun-warmed bark, the air shifting from coolness to warmth, as though the day itself breathed through the grove, its rhythms older than the feast below. No voices rose loudly, only low murmurs drifting among those gathered. The words shaped less for meaning than for sound itself, a slow weaving of tone and breath, blending with the wind's quiet passage through layers of trembling leaves overhead. The hollow tree stood unmoving, as though it had watched countless such feasts before this one, its bark rough where sunlight touched the ridges, dark where shadow filled the cracks, the smell of dry wood mingling with sap weeping slowly near its roots. A drum rested near the stone where berries lay darkening, its frame carved from wood carrying marks smoothed by many hands. The hide stretched pale as clouded moonlight across its surface, though no one yet reached to wake its waiting voice. When the eating ended and the bowls lay empty, the oldest among the hosts rose slowly, joints stiff yet movement steady, carrying the drum toward the center of the grove where sunlight pooled like water spilling through the restless branches above. He struck it once with an open palm, and the sound rolled outward through grass and root and branch until the very air seemed to thicken. The birds falling silent, the leaves pausing briefly, as though wind itself leaned in to listen. Another strike followed slower than the first, then another, until rhythm spread like ripples moving outward from stone tossed into still water, each beat reaching the farthest trunks before curving back soft enough to brush the wanderer's skin like breath. Voices joined slowly, not in songs shaped by words, but in tones rising and falling without pattern, the kind that seemed to remember rivers before they had names, winds before valleys carried walls of stone lifting their shadows against the sun. The children added hollow reeds cut from riverbanks, their edges notched so that air turned to low whistling when blown, the sound weaving with drums and voices until the grove itself seemed to hum beneath the layered weight of tone and wind. The hollow tree held the gathering without movement, yet the wanderers felt its age tremble through the ground beneath them, the roots drinking each drumbeat as though carrying it deeper into the soil, where older songs might still sleep untouched by air. Shadows lengthened as the sun curved lower, stripes of gold falling through the branches until faces shone. Briefly before returning to dusk, where smoke lifted from a small fire kindled with resin, whose sweetness clung to the evening air unshaken. When the last beat fell into silence, the wind moved again through the branches, carrying the smoke outward across the valley floor, where grasses bent beneath its weight, the sound of leaves returning slowly as though waking from a long dream. The wanderers rose with the others when night gathered its first coolness along the path, their cloaks lifting faintly in the wind's renewed hands. The hollow tree, watching as they left the grove behind beneath stars climbing one by one into darkness. The feast ended as quietly as it began. Yet its warmth lingered along the wanderers' steps, not upon tongues or hands or breath alone, but somewhere beneath the ribs where drumbeats and wind and voices had gathered like water behind stone. The night had not fully lifted when the wanderers left the grove behind, the last embers of the fire still glowing faintly in the hollow beneath the great tree whose roots had drunk. the rhythm of drums and the warmth of voices hours before. A thin wind moved across the valley as though carrying the night away in slow, unraveling threads, the grass whispering softly where it bent beneath its touch. The air still cool enough that breaths left pale clouds drifting briefly before dissolving into emptiness. The path that waited ahead curved eastward through meadows where the morning light came late, the hills rising thick with shadows that clung like sleeping animals among folds of stone and root, holding the chill long after the sun began climbing. It was a path few traveled now, marked by cairns of piled rock leaning beneath moss and rain-darkened lichen, the stones holding silence so deep it seemed the weight of centuries pressed gently from above to keep each one in place. The wanderers moved slowly, not from weariness but from the sense that this way carried memory heavier than footsteps alone, each bend holding air thick with the stillness of voices once spoken here before fading into the long hush of earth and wind. Along the edges of the trail stood stalks of river reeds gone dry with the season, their hollow bodies rattling faintly when touched by air, the sound brittle yet strangely melodic, as though some forgotten music still stirred within their pale bones. The ground itself bore marks where roots had risen beneath it, like the backs of old creatures stirring slowly in sleep. The soil cracked in places where last rains had run too quickly to stay, leaving the path hardened beneath the wanderers' feet. They carried no words between them as the hills thickened around the trail, for each felt the narrowing air where the reeds grew denser and the cairns leaned closer, their stones rough and cold beneath fingers when brushed in passing as though greeting them. Sometimes a bird called from the cliffs above, its cry falling sharp before breaking against the walls of stone, the echoes scattering unevenly like beads dropped across flat rock, before fading entirely into the deeper wind moving always eastward ahead of them. The sun came slowly, its warmth held back by veils of thin cloud drifting low across the sky, so that when its light reached the path, it carried the muted tone of metal, cooled in water, pale and without heat. Here and there along the trail bones lay half-sunken soil and grass, not of men but of animals long gone, their shapes held together by little more than dust where ribs curved pale and delicate as reeds bending beneath the weight of wind. Some were gathered carefully into patterns near the cairns, circles or lines that pointed toward hills or streams no longer running, the meaning of such arrangements lost yet carrying intention unmistakable in the way each bone leaned against the others. The wanderers stepped lightly where they passed these places, for the air felt held by something older than caution, as though the ground itself waited to be left undisturbed beneath the long stillness that had gathered here beyond count of seasons. Once they reached a clearing where the reeds gave way to low grass bending beneath the wind, the sky opening above in a sudden sweep of gray light where a single tree stood bare, its branches twisting like black veins against the clouds. Beneath its roots, a pool lay sunken into earth and stone, the water still enough to carry a perfect sky upon its surface, though reeds leaned inward all around, their hollow bodies rattling when the wind pushed them like hands brushing dry beads. The wanderers drank from the pool with cupped hands, the water cold enough to sting teeth and throat before settling deep inside like a stone dropped into dark wells, leaving behind only the faint taste of soil and rain upon the tongue. While they rested there, the wind moved steadily through the reeds, so that the clearing filled with their voices rising thin and uneven, a music built from nothing but air and the hollow bodies left behind after green seasons had long passed. One among the wanderers found a length of reed cut clean by wind or teeth, its edges smooth where it had cracked near the root, and when he raised it to his lips, the air turned through it to a note low and trembling. The sound joined the wind's own voice moving through the clearing until it seemed the earth itself listened, the pool darkening beneath clouds overhead, the tree standing unmoving above its own reflection where reeds bent and rattled in long, uneven breaths. Others lifted reeds where they found them broken, and soon the clearing filled with thin whistles, rising between gusts of wind so that the air carried layers of tone. Like water rippling outward from many stones, dropped one by one into its surface. The bones near the cairns seemed to listen as shadows lengthened across them, though the sun had not yet reached its height. Each curve of rib and hollow of skull holding light softly, as though the day itself moved slower here than beyond the hills. When the wanderers left the clearing, the reeds followed them with voices restless and thin, their bodies leaning inward along the trail as though to keep the music moving until distance thinned it into threads lost among folds of stone and wind. The path climbed then, the cairns standing taller, the stones darker where rain had marked them through years of storms passing from west to east, their rough edges brightened here and there by thin crusts of lichen, pale as ashes scattered on firewood. They walked until the air grew colder, though no clouds gathered above, the wind carrying scents of stone split by sun, of dust lifted from paths long untrodden, of roots clutching soil where water no longer moved except deep beneath the hills. In a narrow pass they found a circle of bones arranged upon flat rock, each one bleached thin as shells left behind by vanished seas. The shapes woven carefully so they crossed and bent like patterns once carved upon clay before hardening in fire. The wind paused there, its silence heavy as though the circle gathered even air into its hollow spaces. The stillness broken only when one wanderer bent to place a length of reed across two bones where they met in pale intersection. When the wind returned, it moved through the reed with a voice sharper than before, the note carrying down the pass until it curved against stone and came back changed, hollow yet deep, as though the cliffs themselves had answered with breath long held. No one spoke afterward, for the sound lingered even after the wind fell quiet again. The circle holding it the way pools hold sky between clouds, the bones unmoving as though waiting for other voices lost before the wanderers were born. They left the pass slowly, each step careful where stone met root, and the ground fell away toward the east where the land sank into shadow, stretching between ridges whose slopes blurred beneath veils of wind-blown dust and thin drifting cloud above. By evening, the path carried them to a rise where the hills opened suddenly toward another valley, the first stars lifting pale above it as the sun folded itself behind the western cliffs, now carrying night upon their long black edges. Below them, the wind moved through reeds invisible in darkness, their voices rising once more, thin yet unbroken, as though they had waited centuries only to speak again. When footsteps followed the forgotten path through bone and shadow and endless moving air. When dawn returned, it came not with brightness, but with a pale diffused light that seemed to seep from the earth, rather than fall from the sky, soft and slow, as though the night itself were reluctant to release its hold upon the valley. The wanderers rose from where they had slept among roots and stones the fire they had built gone to ash, and the smoke of faint ribbon drifting upward until it thinned into the damp air it sent, clinging faintly to the folds of their cloaks. The valley below stretched wide and dim, its floor still wrapped in thin veils of mist that drifted like pale animals grazing silently among reeds and pools their shapes, dissolving whenever the wind moved across the low ground with a long sighing breath. They walked carefully among the wet grasses each step, sending small ripples of dew along the blades that leaned together beneath the weight of water, the chill rising through leather soles until their feet ached, as though the cold carried memory through skin to bone. A stillness clung to the air, not the deep silence of night, but a quiet that seemed filled with something, waiting like voices gathered too far away to hear, yet pressing faintly at the edges of thought without ever breaking the long hush. In places the mist thickened until even the hills beyond were no more than shadows curled beneath a sky where color had not yet returned. The clouds above, pale as cooled iron after rain, holding back any warmth the morning might have carried. Here the wanderers moved slowly, their shapes no more certain than the trees standing half-hidden in drifting fog. Each branch beaded with moisture that fell occasionally in soft, uneven drops, the ground below softening where water gathered in shallow hollows. They followed the sound of running water until it rose steady through the mist. A narrow stream curling between stones. Green with moss, where the air smelled faintly of iron and wet leaves pressed flat beneath seasons of rain. The stream carried fragments of wood and fallen reed through pools where its surface broke softly against roots that had grown around it over countless years, their bark polished smooth by water touching them again and again beneath the passing winds. Kneeling beside the current, they washed their hands and faces, the cold biting sharply at first, before settling into their skin. Like a silence of its own, the water so clear it carried sky and stone together upon its shifting surface. One of them filled a vessel carved from gourd and left it resting on a rock where the stream bent sharply. The water inside trembling with each gust of wind passing overhead through branches wet with the breath of morning. Above the mist, the first calls of birds began to break unevenly across the air. Their voices thin and wandering, as though the day itself were stirring from deep sleep, each note scattering before vanishing again into the folds of fog. The wanderers stood listening, their faces turned upward, where the pale shapes of birds moved like drifting fragments of night across. The soft gray light gathering slowly above the valley as the wind carried feathers and leaves along unseen currents. Further along the stream, they found where the ground rose slightly toward the edge of the hills. The earth firmer there beneath grasses, less burdened by water, the soil smelling faintly of clay, and the char left by some long-forgotten fire. The air changed as they climbed, the mist loosening around them so that the valley below spread wide once more. The pools catching faint light where the sun tried to break through the layers of thinning clouds still holding the horizon. Here, the drums had once been heard, though now only wind moved across the reeds whose dry bodies leaned together in restless clusters the music that had carried through them. The night before, gone as though it had slipped beneath the earth while they slept. Yet the wanderers felt it still not in sound, but in the rhythm of air moving across skin and cloth. In the way water struck stone and the faint pulse of leaves brushing one another, when gusts moved through the high branches overhead. Among the rocks, they found markings carved shallowly into stone lines crossing in patterns, whose meanings were long lost, yet carried the certainty of hands moving here. Long before there's each groove softened by rain, until its edges blurred like memory. They touched the carvings lightly, as though greeting whoever had cut them into the world. The stone cooled beneath their fingers, the shapes, gathering moisture that ran slowly along the grooves before falling in small beads to the ground below. The wind pressed through the pass behind them, carrying scents of wet earth, of woodlong, fallen beneath moss, of water running steadily toward the unseen places where valleys narrowed into deeper folds. The sun rarely reached, except in midsummer. They walked until the markings ended, the last lines vanishing beneath lichen, pale as ash, the rock beyond them smooth, where centuries of storms had moved across it with rain and wind wearing the surface down until it gleamed faintly like old bone. By midday, the sky thinned further, clouds parting just enough to let light fall in uneven bands across the valley. The warmth faint, yet carrying the smell of dust, lifting from stones, slowly drying where water left them under the weak sun. The wanderers paused where a fallen tree stretched across a shallow gully, its roots torn upward in a frozen gesture of reaching toward the sky, even as earth and rock clung stubbornly to the twisted shapes beneath its weathered trunk. Here, they ate what little they carried the food dry, yet tasting faintly of smoke from past fires, the air around them filled with the rustle of grasses bending as wind pressed slowly across the slope, leading down again toward the valley floor. Beyond the gully, the path curved into low ground where water pooled in long channels, reflecting both sky and reeds, the air cooler here, as though the day itself paused, gathering breath before evening began to slide gently toward the edges of light. The wanderers crossed carefully, their reflections moving faintly upon the surface of each pool, the shapes breaking apart whenever wind touched the water before slowly returning as though the earth itself wished to hold their passing a moment longer. In the far distance, the hills rose again, dark where the sun slid lower behind them. The shadows stretching long across the valley floor until pools of water caught only the last glints of light breaking through clouds drifting unevenly toward night. The wind thickened with the smell of rain, though no drops yet fell, carrying instead the faint, dry music of reeds moving against one another in low clusters along the stream that still wound silver beneath the fading light. By the time they reached the next rise, the day had nearly folded into itself, the first stars trembling faintly where clouds parted above the darkening hills. The air cooling sharply with the promise of another long night gathering beyond the valley's edge. The wanderers paused there in silence, the last bands of sun burning low before vanishing, the wind carrying only the soft voices of reeds below. As though waiting for the drums to speak again when darkness returned to the silent valleys once more. Night returned slowly, the sky deepening into layers of blue so dark they seemed carved from stone. The first stars trembling faintly above the valley, as though cautious to reveal themselves. Too soon before the last colors of day surrendered to shadow. The wanderers gathered where the hills rose gently above the reed-filled hollows. The air colder now, carrying the thin bite of wind, moving unhindered across the open spaces, where water shivered beneath a sky drained of warmth and heavy with silence. They lit no fire this time, letting the night fold around them unbroken, the darkness carrying the sense of wet earth, crushed grass, and distant rain slipping along the ridges where clouds thickened like slow rivers wandering through the heavens above. The moon rose behind them, its pale rim climbing slowly until it hung above the valley with the quiet authority of something older than the hills themselves, its light turning water to silver and trees to dark shapes leaning together in stillness. Shadows stretched long across the ground, bending over stones and roots, each movement of wind breaking them softly apart before stitching them together again. The valley breathing in time with the slow swaying of branches above the pools of dark water. It was then the drums returned, not sudden, but low and far, as though the earth itself had begun to speak through its hollows. The first beats moving gently beneath the air like ripples widening across a surface no hand had touched. The wanderers listened without stirring, the rhythm deep and patient, rolling through the valley like the memory of footsteps from those who had walked here long before their own voices would ever rise and vanish beneath the same stars. Each beat carried through the ground, trembling faintly along stone and soil until it reached them where they sat among grass heavy with dew. The sound neither near nor distant, but everywhere at once, as if woven into the night itself. The wind shifted as though answering, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke, though no fire burned. Only the dry scent of wood, long buried in soil after seasons of rain, had darkened it into the color of forgotten things. The rhythm deepened, slow and steady, as if it had learned the heartbeat of the valley itself. Each pulse rising from hills where the moonlight slid over ridges and fell into places even starlight could not follow through the folds of earth. The wanderers felt it beneath their hands pressed lightly to the ground, the vibration moving through soil and root and stone like something living yet older than breath, something bound to the turning of stars above silent waters below. No voices followed, only the drums speaking in patterns that seemed to circle back upon themselves, weaving through air and earth as though calling to things that no longer walked beneath these hills except in the music of wind and shadow. The reeds below began to sway as gusts moved through them, their dry bodies brushing softly together until they carried their own trembling song. A thin, restless harmony to the deeper pulse that still held the night in its patient grip. Clouds shifted slowly above the hills, unveiling more stars that trembled faintly in cold air, their reflections scattering across pools where insects stirred briefly, before the chill sent them crawling again into the shelter of leaves along the darkened banks. The wanderers rose without speaking, moving toward the edge of the valley where rock jutted above water, the ground slick beneath, their steps as though the earth itself were waiting for them to feel its weight before the night fully turned. They stood beneath the moon's pale circle as the drums carried on, neither quickening nor fading. Only steady as the hills themselves, a rhythm so certain it felt carved into the silence rather than breaking it apart with sound. One of them knelt to touch the stone where faint carvings caught the moonlight. The lines worn nearly smooth, yet still holding the shapes of spirals and crossing paths, as though the earth remembered the hands that had left them there. The cold sank deeper as the wind turned, sliding along the valley floor with the smell of water lifting where reeds bent low, their roots drinking from pools that caught pieces of moonlight between ripples spreading gently from falling leaves. The wanderers watched the hills beyond, where shadows thickened, their slopes folding one over another until distance erased all edges. The sky above them burning with stars, too many to name, as though the night carried its own unspoken music. Still, the drums moved through the valley, patient as breath, steady as the pull of rivers beneath ice, their rhythm neither asking nor answering, only continuing as though it had begun long before valleys formed beneath the turning of wind. The wanderers closed their eyes briefly, feeling the ground's faint trembling beneath them, the air cool upon their faces, the night carrying scents of pine, wet stone, and the slow decay of leaves pressed into soil by years of passing rain. When the drums finally began to fade, it was not with silence but with distance, as though the earth were drawing its voice inward again, carrying it down through root and riverbank until only wind moved along the hollow spaces left behind. The reeds whispered on without them, bending and swaying beneath currents too light to break the surface of water, their dry voices scattering across the valley floor until even they fell quiet beneath the deepening cold. Stars brightened as clouds moved on, leaving the sky wide and unbroken above hills where no light but their own touched the stone. The moon sliding lower toward ridges where night would gather longest before morning returned again. The wanderers stayed until the last echo slid from the air like breath leaving glass. The ground beneath them still as bone, the hills around them folded into darkness where no wind stirred and no sound followed the passing of the drums. When they finally turned away, the valley lay silent behind them, its waters catching the stars without movement, the reeds standing motionless as though listening for a music that would not return before another turning of countless seasons. The path led upward, where stone cut sharply against the night sky, the air growing colder as they climbed, each step scattering frost along the edges of grass where the moonlight turned the ground pale beneath their passing. Above the valley they paused once more, the earth spreading wide below them, its pools and slopes silvered by moonlight. The silence so deep it felt carved into the land itself, as though the world had chosen stillness over sound forever. They left before dawn, the sky behind them paling faintly, where stars thinned toward the edge of night, the last wind carrying the cold scent of water and stone, the valley already folding the echoes of the drums into its endless sleep. And so they passed beyond it, the music gone, yet lingering in the weight of air and earth, in the soft rhythm of steps moving onward, in the way silence itself seemed to remember the beating long after it had ended beneath the stars.